I want to talk a little bit about the impacts of Brexit on the EU ETS. For those who need a reminder there, the EU ETS regulates about 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the EU. That's mostly carbon dioxide, but a little bit of nitrous, a little bit of methane, a little bit of the HFCs. And those greenhouse gases originate from some 11,000 installations across Europe. The EU ETS is currently in its third phase, which runs from 2013 to 2020. Emission permits are issued by the member states, but they are valid across the EU. And an emission permit grants the right to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent at any time after January 1st, 2013. As it stands, the UK will leave the EU on March 30, 2019. When she was Home Secretary, Theresa May lost several high-profile cases in the European Court of Justice, and therefore I think Brexit means that the UK will leave the European Court of Justice. If you leave the European Court of Justice, you will also leave the EU ETS. The emissions trading system is regulated by the European Court of Justice, so that's the logical implication. It's not because the UK would be leaving the European Union, because Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein are all part of the EU ETS without being part of the EU. So there's no immediate connection between the EU and the EU ETS, but it's the European Court of Justice, and May's insistence that the Supreme Court in the UK is the highest court means that the UK will most likely leave the EU ETS. Now there's two things that may happen. We may have a transition agreement or we may not have a transition agreement. And if there is a transition agreement after March 2019, then there should not be a big problem. If the UK will stay within the EU ETS until the end of 2020, then the main implication of Brexit in this regard will be that the European Commission, particularly DG Climate Action, will need to redo some of its preparatory homework for the fourth phase of the EU ETS. And that will essentially be the main implication for the EU. However, if there's no transition agreements, then legal problems may emerge. And I think the legal problems are actually more important than the economic problems from the perspective of the rest of the EU. Two things will need to be done. First, the total amount of permits will need to be adjusted downwards because one of the partners in the EU ETS will have left. But the amount of the downwards adjustment is only some 270 million tons of CO2 equivalent for 2019 and 2020. And this is relatively small compared to the 900 million tons of CO2 that the EU plans to re-inject. Those are the delayed auctions from earlier as well as this year actually. So the EU has a reserve fund of 900 million tons and that will need to be cut to 630. I don't think that will be a major political problem. There's definitely no administrative or regulatory problem there. They will just need to adjust those numbers downwards. More problematically perhaps is the monitoring and enforcement of these emission permits. It's the member states who issue these permits, it's the member states who monitor emissions, and it's the member states who enforce emission reduction and prosecute companies that sell their permits without reducing emissions. In the UK, this has actually been devolved to the 4 nations, apart from offshore emissions that are run from DEFRA. And that means that unless the Welsh government and the English government and the Scottish government and the Northern Irish government agree to continue to monitor and enforce emission reductions, the emission permits that originate in the UK and circulate in the rest of Europe will have no legal standing whatsoever. And that can cause potential problems for the buyers of those permits or the current holders of those permits. It's a bit unclear what would happen there. What we know at the moment is that the relation that the UK is of course doing the negotiations with the EU. The relationship between the UK central government and the Scottish government is not the best. There is no Northern Irish government at the moment, so it's a bit unclear what would happen there, but it's potentially an issue. I am not aware of an easy source of information that would allow me to quantify this problem and say it's 7% of emissions that circulate in the EU would have this problem. I simply don't know, and I'm not convinced that anybody knows. So that is from the side of the rest of the EU 27. The issues on the UK side are actually quite a bit bigger and more substantial. In 2013, 19% of emission reductions in the UK were met by imported permits. That's 1 in 5. In 2014, that was 25%, 1 in 4. The numbers for 2015 and 2016 are not out yet. They sort of suggest that less permits were imported, but it is a fairly big chunk as far as we can see. And you saw that immediately after the referendum in the price of the emission permits, which dropped by 20% in the 4 weeks. Before the referendum, the average price was €586, and that dropped to €467 in the 4 weeks after. So that's a 20% price drop, which partly, I think, reflects the expected reduction in demand from the UK, and partly reflects the expected reduction in economic growth. So the EU ETS is a major part of UK climate policy, and the UK has greatly benefited from the option to import permits, and throwing away that option will be costly for the UK. And it's not just the EU ETS, it's actually pervasive throughout climate policy in the UK. Commission for Climate Change, that's the major regulator for these sort of issues in the UK, reckons that EU policy accounts for 55%, that's well more than half, of the planned UK emission reduction by 2020. So the EU is simply very big in this regard in the UK. As it stands, the UK is as committed as ever to greenhouse gas emission reduction. There is no plan whatsoever to reduce its targets or adjust its targets. My understanding is that the UK is less committed to the EU targets on renewables and all those sort of things, but I don't think it is likely that the UK will abandon its CO2 targets. And that implies that the UK has, if there's no transition agreement, a little bit less than 2 years, and if there is a transition agreement, perhaps 4 years to replace all this. For those of you who are not so familiar with the UK, at the moment the central government is shrinking, mostly because of austerity. There's fewer and fewer civil servants. At the same time, the plan is of course to repatriate a lot of government tasks from Brussels back to Westminster. Estimates are that this would easily occupy 30,000 civil servants. The civil service is of course also heavily involved in the negotiation with the EU 27. And of course it's preparing for the economic, social and political change that is going to come after Brexit. So the government is rather busy. And then for this particular problem, there is the additional issue that the Department for Energy and Climate Change no longer exists, and part of its tasks have been shifted to DEFRA and other parts have been shifted to BIS. So there's also internal restructuring going on. I will be very surprised if there is a replacement regulation in the UK by 2019 or even by 2021. I simply don't think the regulatory capacity is there. And what we have seen in the first 10 months since the referendum is actually very little from the government. There's been very little discussion, there's been very little preparation. The lobby groups, industry groups have been far more active, but of course they can't do much without guidance from the government as to where things are going. So I think that Brexit, from a perspective of the EU ETS in particular, and from a perspective of climate policy, will be rather problematic for the UK. Problems for the EU 27 I think are much more manageable and much smaller, but if you're worried about greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, then Brexit should really, really worry you. That's all I want to say. Thank you.